He was the most feared king in the realm. She was the woman he'd declared dead and buried in his memory. For 7 years he ruled behind sealed iron gates, certain she was gone. But the woman standing in the torchlight outside those gates is very much alive, and the child holding her hand has his eyes. The gates of Valdric Morn's stronghold had been closed for 7 years, not merely locked, not simply barred, sealed with iron bolts and black timber, and the decree of an Alpha King, who had decided, one bitter winter morning, that grief was something a man could wall out if he built the walls high enough. The people of Ashenveil had learned not to speak of it. They learned which subjects made the king's jaw go tight, and which made his amber gold eyes go flat and empty as a winter lake. The Luna was one. The past was another. The woman with copper hair was the third. 7 years, and the gates had never opened for visitors after dark. Seren had not planned to arrive after dark. She had planned to arrive in daylight, with dignity, with the speech she had rehearsed 100 times on the forest road. She had planned to be calm. She had planned not to shake. But the cartwheel had split on the eastern ridge, and the driver had been too old to fix it quickly, and by the time they'd reached the valley, the sun was long gone, and the torches along Ashenveil's outer wall were lit orange against a sky that had gone the colour of old iron. The child beside her was quiet. He had been quiet the whole journey, which was a mercy. He was 6 years old, and he had her pointed chin, and God help her, his father's amber gold eyes, luminous even in the dark, lit from within by something that had nothing to do with the torches. "Is this it?" he asked. His voice was small, but it had never been timid. Seren looked at the gates, black iron over black timber. Ashenveil's crest, the wolf's head, worked into both doors in hammered relief. Torchlight caught the metal and made the wolf's eyes glow. "Yes," she said, "this is it." She had been dragged away from these gates by men who had used her like a bundle of old cloth. She had been told she was dead. She had spent 6 years in a stone cottage at the edge of the Thornwood, surviving on stubbornness and the memory of her own name. And now she was standing in the torchlight with her son's hand in hers, and her heart lodged somewhere in the vicinity of her throat. She was small-boned but strong. She had always been small-boned but strong, a hill family body built for endurance over impression. And she had learned in the Thornwood to lean on that strength until it became ordinary. She was leaning on it now. Her copper hair was pinned in haste, a strand loose against her pale, freckled cheek. Her travelling cloak had been mended twice at the left shoulder. Her pale, sage-green eyes were steady on the gate, and her pointed chin was level. She knocked. The sound reached Valdric in his great hall, where he sat at the long table with 3 of his council members and a territorial dispute that had been grinding on for 2 months. It was not the knock itself. It was his wolf. His wolf had been asleep for 7 years. Not truly sleeping, more like dormant, pressed flat, something that had curled into the back of his chest the morning he was told she was gone and had not stirred since. He had grown accustomed to the silence of it. He had stopped being surprised by the silence of it. He had begun, in the last year or 2, to assume the silence was permanent. Now it moved, not much. A small shift, like something lifting its head. Valdric set down his goblet. My king? Corvin, his beta, was watching him with that careful expression that meant he'd noticed something he'd never mention unless asked. "The gates," Valdric said. "Nothing at the gates. We'd have been—" And then the horn sounded. 2 short notes. An unknown arrival. After dark. Valdric was already standing. He went to the gatehouse himself, which was not protocol. Protocol said a guard captain checked, reported, and the king decided from inside. Protocol kept kings alive, and king's dignity intact. Valdric had not followed protocol since the night Seren Ashby had been declared dead in a courtyard 2 leagues from here. He remembered that night with the kind of detail that never dulled. The cold stone under his knees, the court physician's voice reading the declaration aloud in that bloodless official monotone, the way Corvin had put a hand on his shoulder and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. He remembered the precise weight of the seal in his hand when they'd brought him the death decree to countersign, and the way his fingers had not shaken, and how he had hated himself for that, for the steadiness, as if composure were something he owed her at least the failure of. He remembered deciding, in that frozen moment, that he had made exactly one catastrophic error in his life, and that he would spend the rest of it making certain it never happened again. The error had been letting her exist at the margins of his court without sufficient protection. He had been so certain of his own strength that he had not considered what others might do to the things adjacent to it. She had been at the edge of his world, and he had left the edge unguarded, and she had paid the price of his arrogance. He came through the gatehouse passageway, and the guards snapped upright, and then he saw the torchlight catch her hair. He stopped. It was the same, copper red, like autumn laid over fire, the kind of colour that had no business existing on a woman the world had already buried. It was pinned badly. She'd always been impatient with pins, and a strand had escaped across her pale, freckled cheek. She was thinner than he remembered. There were lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before. She was wearing a travelling cloak that had been mended twice at the left shoulder. She was alive. Valdric's wolf came fully awake for the first time in 7 years, and the feeling was something between relief and agony, so tangled he had no name for it. It pressed up through his chest like a tide coming in, filling spaces he had convinced himself were simply structural, simply the shape of him, simply what the inside of a man looked like after enough years of ruled grief. He couldn't move. She could. Seren Ashby looked up from the torch in the gate guard's hand, and her pale, sage-green eyes found him, and her chin lifted, that pointed chin he had mapped 100 times with his thumb in the year they'd had together. And she said, in a voice that was careful and controlled and barely shaking at all, "I would like to come in." It was then that he saw the child, small, dark-haired, standing very still beside her with one hand in hers, and both amber gold eyes fixed on Valdric with an expression of absolute calm that Valdric recognized because he'd seen it on his own face in every polished shield in the hall, and every still water in the courtyard cistern, and every mirror he'd ever had the misfortune of standing in front of during a long council session. The world went very quiet. "Open the gates," Valdric said. They put her in the north wing, which had been her wing. He wondered if that had been deliberate, some ghost of memory operating through the castle's household, or simply the only chamber aired and ready. Either way, she walked into it with a brief, contained expression that told him she had not expected to see it again. She stood in the centre of the room for a moment, with her son at her side, and her hand still in his, and then she breathed, and squared her small shoulders, and let him go to the housekeeper. They sat across from each other in the small receiving room off the main corridor, the fire between them, and they were alone, because he'd sent the child with the housekeeper, and the child had gone without complaint, examining everything within reach with those observant amber eyes. She was watching him. She had always watched carefully. Another thing he'd noticed too late, how much attention she paid to the room around her, how little she missed. "Start wherever you want," he said. She looked at the fire. Her hands were folded in her lap, still, but he could see the tension in her wrists. "Your court declared me dead," she said. "Officially. The court physician and 2 witnesses. They said I had fallen from the east ridge on the night of the harvest moon." Valdric waited. "I did not fall. I was taken. By your court physician and those same 2 witnesses, who had been paid very well by someone who wanted me gone. They meant to throw me from the ridge. They had been thorough about it. They told me who had paid them. They told me before they dragged me out there The way people who intend no surviving witnesses tell things. Her voice was even. I ran. I don't know how. I was already injured when I ran. They'd restrained me and I'd fought, and my shoulder was badly wrenched, and there was blood on my sleeve from a guard's ring catching my arm. I made it into the Thornwood, and I found a woodcutter's path, and I followed it until I couldn't walk anymore. Who paid them? His voice was flat. He already suspected. Her pale, sage eyes came up to his. Mireille Voss. Platinum-haired, cold blue-eyed, the kind of beautiful that came with an air of expensive stillness, and a smile that curdled slightly on close inspection. He had thought her a loyal counselor. He had valued her precision, and her access to the court's social architecture, and her talent for knowing what every person in a room wanted before they asked for it. He had not understood what she'd wanted until too late. She told them, Seren continued, that you had already given the order, that you wanted me gone quietly, that the death would be declared natural, and you wouldn't ask questions you didn't want answered. The silence in the room was absolute. She told them I had commanded it, Valdric said. Yes. He stood up. He crossed to the window and stood there with his back to her, because if he looked at her face in that moment, he was not certain what would remain of his composure. Outside, the courtyard was dark, the torches burning at the corners, the wolf's head banner moving in a cold wind off the valley. 7 years. She had spent 7 years believing he had ordered her death. She had run from him. She had survived alone, injured, carrying their son in a world that had told her the man she had mated had wanted her dead. She had built a life in the Thornwood from nothing, from sheer refusal to be finished, and she had raised that boy alone, and never stopped being his mother for a single day. And the whole time, the whole 7 years, he had been sitting behind sealed gates grieving a lie. He pressed one hand flat against the cold stone of the window frame. The child, he said, he was born in the Thornwood. In a cottage on the Thornwood's eastern edge, a healer took me in. Her voice was steady. She had had 7 years to practice steadiness. I didn't know I was with child until 2 months after I arrived. I named him Aaron. He is 6. Does he know who his father is? He knows you exist. A pause. I did not know whether to tell him more than that, until I knew whether it was safe to come here. Valdric turned. She was watching him with those pale, sage-green eyes, and the expression on her face was not softness, and it was not forgiveness, and it was not the uncertain girl he'd first met at a border treaty gathering, when she'd argued a point of regional law with the confidence of someone twice her age, and made 3 of his council members look at their boots. It was something harder earned than any of those earlier things. It was the face of a woman who had built her own survival from the ground up and knew precisely what it had cost. I didn't order it, he said. It came out rougher than he'd meant. Whatever you believed for 7 years, I need you to know. I know. She looked at her hands. I know now. A merchant from Ashenveil passed through the Thornwood 2 summers ago. He told me, without knowing who I was, that Mireille Voss had been stripped of her position, that the 2 witnesses had confessed under questioning after a long investigation, that the king had... She stopped. That you had torn the court apart, looking for the truth. A breath. You believed I was dead. I know that. Valdric said nothing. I stayed away anyway, she said quietly, because I didn't know if returning was safe, because Aaron was small, because I needed to be sure that what the merchant said was true and not another deception. She met his eyes. And because I was frightened. It cost her to say that. He could see it in the way she held herself, the slight adjustment of her spine, the expressive brows held carefully neutral. You should have come back the moment you knew, he said. And it came out wrong, too hard, the kind of thing that had always been wrong from him. Her chin went up. I should have come back, she said, when I believed it would not get my son killed. I made the decision I could make with what I had. I would make it again. He looked at her for a long moment. Then, very slowly, he sat back down. "Tell me about the last 7 years," he said. "All of it." She talked until the fire had burned to low coals, and he listened. Not just heard, listened. He had been a poor listener in the years before she disappeared. He'd had no time for it, or had told himself he had no time, which he understood now was a different thing. He'd been a king before he'd learned to be a man, and that sequence left marks. Seren talked about the healer, an old woman named Brith, who had asked no questions and expected no explanations, and who had delivered Aaron in a February snowstorm while the wind came through the thatch with opinions. She talked about Aaron's first winter, which had been brutal, and his first words, which had been a direct command at 11 months. He had pointed at a bowl of porridge and said "more," in a tone that left no room for interpretation. And Brith had laughed for 5 minutes and told Seren the blood would tell. She talked about learning to stretch a fire's heat across an uninsulated room, and about bartering embroidery work for winter grain, and about the particular silence of the Thornwood in February, which was not a peaceful silence but an old one. She talked about Aaron learning to walk on uneven stone floors, about his habit of collecting feathers and lining them up by size on the cottage windowsill, about the way he slept with his fists closed, both of them, like even in sleep, he was ready for whatever came through the door. She did not talk about the grief. She did not talk about the years before the merchant had passed through, the years when she had believed she had mated a man who had signed her death warrant with his cold signature and felt nothing. He suspected she would not talk about those years for a very long time, if ever, and he would not ask. When the fire was coals and the candles had burned low, she fell silent. Valdric looked at her across the quiet room, her copper hair half fallen from its pins, her small-boned frame still precise and composed in the chair, her pale freckled hands folded in her lap, and felt something break loose in his chest that had been lodged there since the night Corvin had told him she was gone. "Aaron should be sleeping," she said. "I should check. The housekeeper will have seen to it. She's been here 30 years. I know." She'd liked the housekeeper. Had once told Valdric she was one of 3 people in the whole stronghold who'd simply talked to her without wanting something from the conversation. He had been ashamed to realize he hadn't known that. "Seren." He said her name and she looked at him. "You came back, after 7 years and every reason in the world to stay gone. Why now?" She was quiet for a moment. "Because Aaron is old enough to ask questions," she said. "And the questions he's asking deserve real answers, not stories." She looked at the dead fire. "Because he has your eyes and your temper, and he deserves to know what those things mean, and where they come from." She paused. "And because I was tired of the cottage." It was the last one that told him the truth. He'd learned, years ago, to listen for the things she said last, because the things she said last were the ones she hadn't rehearsed. She was exhausted, not from the journey, from 7 years of surviving alone, doing everything herself, pouring everything she had into keeping them both alive and intact and decent. And she had done it so well that it looked like she had always been this strong. She had always been this strong. He hadn't known that either before. He knew it now. "You'll stay," he said. "Not a request. An offer that is also a statement. You and Aaron will stay in the North Wing for as long as you want, which I will interpret as permanently, unless you tell me otherwise." She looked at him. "And Mireille?" "In a cell in the lower keep," he said. "She has been since the confessions 2 years ago. She will be tried before a formal tribunal next month. You are a material witness. Your testimony, if you choose to give it, will end it." Something shifted in her face. Not relief exactly, more like the release of a weight she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten it had a shape. "I'll testify," she said. They met Aaron in the morning. Not formally. Valdric was in the great hall reviewing the morning's dispatch when the door opened and Aaron walked in, followed by the housekeeper, who had the expression of a woman who had attempted to intercept something inevitable and had known she would fail. Aaron walked to the center of the hall, looked up at Valdric with those amber gold eyes, and said, "You're tall." Valdric looked at him. "Yes," he said. "My mother is small. She says it's because her family were hill people, and hill people are built for climbing, not reaching." He considered. "Are you a hill person?" "No." "Then why are you tall?" A pause. Something that was not quite a smile moved through Valdric's chest. "My father was tall," he said, "and his father before him." Aaron absorbed this with the expression of someone doing serious calculation. He was wearing a dark tunic that was slightly too large for him, borrowed from the castle stores, Valdric assumed, and he had a feather tucked into his belt with what appeared to be deliberate intention. "My mother says you didn't know about me," Aaron said, directly, without cruelty, but without softening it either. "That's correct. She says that wasn't your fault. That is also correct, though I intend to do better with the time that remains." Aaron looked at him with those ancient amber eyes, and Valdric had the unsettling experience of recognizing himself in miniature. Not vanity, but something more foundational, the same fundamental shape of thought, the same way of holding still when he was deciding something important and not yet ready to speak. "All right," Aaron said after a moment. That was all. He turned and walked out, presumably back to wherever the housekeeper had been trying to take him. The housekeeper met Valdric's eyes with an expression of combined apology and admiration, and followed the child out. Seren was in the north courtyard when Valdric found her, standing near the old training post, with her arms folded and her face turned toward the morning light. She'd had the north courtyard window in her chambers when she'd lived here. He hadn't known she had liked it for the morning light. He was learning at speed how much he had not known. "He found you," she said. "He found the great hall. I happened to be in it." She smiled. It was small, a contained thing, like she hadn't yet decided how much of it was safe to give, but it was real, and it reached her pale sage-green eyes, and it hit Valdric somewhere under his sternum with the particular accuracy of things that are completely earned. "He does that," she said. "Finds things he's looking for. He told me you'd said the absence wasn't my fault." She was quiet. "It wasn't," she said. "You believed I was dead. You couldn't grieve what you were told didn't need grieving, and you couldn't search for what the court physician signed his name to in the official record. The fault was Mireille's, and mine perhaps, for the last 2 years, when I knew you hadn't ordered it, and I still waited. You waited to be certain it was safe. I waited because I was afraid." Her voice was even. "Of coming back and finding out that the things I'd told Aaron about you, in the years when I had to say something, in the years when he needed a father even in story form, I was afraid of coming back and finding those stories wrong." A silence. "You can grieve a dead man however you need to. A living one has to actually be the thing you said he was." Valdric stood beside her and looked at the morning light on the courtyard stone. "What did you tell him?" "That his father was fair," she said quietly. "That he was strict and demanding but never cruel. That when he was wrong about something he said so, which is rarer than it should be in kings." She paused. "That he would have wanted to know about him." The blade in his chest again. He turned to look at her. The copper of her hair caught the morning. It always had. It had been one of the first things he'd noticed. That vivid colour like the world had been saving it up. And her pointed chin was up, and her expressive brows were set, and she was entirely herself, entirely Seren, having survived 7 years of the worst the world had to offer, and come out the other side still intact. "Those things are true," he said. "I know." Her pale sage eyes met his. "I knew what you were underneath the king. That is why it hurt as much as it did." She let out a breath. I am not telling you this to wound you. I know that too. They stood in the morning light. A bird was calling from the north tower. Somewhere inside the castle, Aaron was probably cross-examining the housekeeper about the architectural history of the keep. He'll want to know everything, Seraine said. About the castle, about the court, about being an Alpha King's son. He has questions stored up like firewood. He can ask them. It will be relentless. Good. Valdric looked at the courtyard. I have 7 years of questions of my own. She looked at him sideways, and there was something in that look, careful, considering, not yet warm, but not closed, that he filed away as the beginning of something. Not forgiveness, not yet. Not the ease of what they'd had before, which had been new and unfinished anyway, a thing barely begun before it was severed, but the beginning of something that might, with time and honesty, and the particular stubbornness they apparently shared, become worth the name. The tribunal convened 3 weeks later. It was held in the great hall, which had been cleared and formatted for formal proceedings. The long table moved aside, the council chairs arranged in 2 rows, the torches doubled in their brackets so that everything was illuminated and nothing was shadowed. It had the cold precision of a room that had been prepared for something final. Seraine stood at the witness position, which was a simple square of stone floor marked by an iron ring set in the ground. Old court custom, meant to show that the witness stood alone and unbound and spoke of their own will. She stood in it, in the dark green gown the castle seamstress had made in 4 days, and she looked at the assembled court with pale sage-green eyes that did not move to Mireille until she chose to move them. 50 pairs of eyes watched her. Some of them she recognized. Some were new. Some had been present 7 years ago, on the night she'd been dragged away from this stronghold by men she'd trusted, because the king had trusted them. She saw those faces register her, saw the particular discomfort of people who had believed a lie they'd had no reason to question, and she did not feel satisfaction at their discomfort. She felt simply present, real. In the room, she had been told she would never enter again. She gave her testimony in a voice that did not shake once. She described the night, the court physician's face, the weight of the hands on her arms as they dragged her toward the east ridge, her boots scraping on the frozen courtyard stones, the fall of torchlight on the iron ring of keys that she'd snatched from a guard's belt in the last second of her fight to stay alive, snatched and thrown into the dark undergrowth so they'd have to search for them, buying herself the minute she needed to run. She described the thornwood in the dark and the cut on her shoulder that had bled through 2 wrapped bindings by the time she found the woodcutter's path. She described all of it, and her pale sage-green eyes were steady, and her pointed chin did not drop once. Mireille Voss, brought in under guard with her platinum hair still immaculate, and her cold blue eyes still carrying that air of someone accustomed to being the most composed person in any room, looked at Seraine across the hall. "She lies," Mireille said. Her voice was still composed. Still that beautiful evenness, that voice like cold water that Seraine had once found impressive and had later understood was simply the sound of a person who felt no particular weight to their words. She always lied. She was always making herself pitiful, weaving herself into the king's regard through... Enough. Valdric's voice came from the throne, and it was not loud, but it stopped everything in the room the way a stone wall stops water. He looked at Mireille with his amber gold eyes gone flat as winter. "The witnesses have already confessed. Your correspondence has been read into the record. The guard who was bribed has testified to the arrangement and the amount. There is nothing left to dispute. You may speak to make a case for mercy if you have one, or you may remain silent." Mireille's composure cracked. It was small, a tightening around those cold blue eyes, a fractional loss of that perfect stillness, the immaculate posture dropping 1 degree from its usual perfection. But Seraine had learned, in 7 years of surviving by reading rooms correctly and people accurately, to catch small things. She was afraid. Good. The verdict came before the torches burned low. Exile, permanent, documented, stripped of title and lands, and every thread of the Ashenveil court's protection. The estate seized and assigned to reparation. Her name struck from the council records. Not death. Valdric had been deliberate about that, had told Seren the night before, in the quiet of the receiving room, that he would not make her a martyr, or her crimes a story that could be simplified into martyrdom. A cage, he had said, is worse than a grave, for a woman who was only ever satisfied by the admiration of a room. Serene had looked at him then, and thought, not for the first time, that she had been right about what he was underneath the king. The gates of Ashenveil opened fully the following morning. Valdric ordered it at dawn. Both doors, drawn wide on their iron hinges for the first time in 7 years, the sound of them travelling across the empty courtyard in the grey light before sunrise. He stood in the gatehouse arch and watched the morning light fall through, watched the mist move in from the valley, watched the road that had been empty for 7 years lie there golden and ordinary and newly available to the world. Aaron stood beside him. He had been waiting there when Valdric arrived, sitting on the gatehouse step with the feather in his belt and both hands in his lap, watching the gates the way he watched everything, fully, without showing that he was doing it. "Why did you close them?" he asked. Valdric looked at the gates, at the iron and the timber and the wolf's head crest, at the weight of what he'd built out of grief and called governance. "Because grief can make a man foolish," he said, "and foolish men build walls." Aaron considered this. He was running the feather through his fingers in the absent way that meant he was thinking hard. "My mother didn't build walls," he said. "No. She built a cottage." Valdric looked at him. "She built a fire," Aaron said, with the precision of a 6-year-old who had been paying close attention to the facts of his own life. "Every morning, even in summer for cooking, she said—" He stopped, ran the feather through his fingers once more. "She said fire is more useful than walls. Walls keep things out. Fire calls things in." Valdric was quiet for a moment. "She said that. A lot." He looked back at the open gates, at the morning light and the road and the valley coming slowly visible as the mist lifted. 7 years, a sealed gate and a cold throne, and the particular foolishness of a man who had decided that nothing getting in also meant nothing getting out. He had not been living. He had been preserving something, grief, or the shape of grief, or the shape of himself before grief had arrived, and calling it governance. He reached down, took the feather from Aaron's hand, and tucked it properly into the boy's belt, the way the boy had had it, but straighter. "Come on," he said. "Your mother will want breakfast." Aaron looked up at him, those amber gold eyes, enormous in his small face, utterly unimpressed by rank and entirely interested in the person standing in front of him. "Will you eat with us?" he asked. Valdric looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," he said, "every morning, if that suits." Aaron turned and walked back toward the castle without ceremony, but his hand, small, certain, unasking, found Valdric's as he walked, and held it, and didn't let go. The gates stayed open. They were still open the following week, when Seren stood at the north courtyard window in the early morning, and watched Aaron drag Valdric toward the stables to look at the horses, and Valdric went, massive and broad-shouldered, and moving with that warrior's economy, the thin line through his left brow catching the light, his dark as pitch hair, and those amber gold eyes bent to hear whatever the child was telling him about the relative merits of different saddle horses. And she thought, there it is. Not forgiveness, finished and tied off, not the past undone. Just this, the present, open, the gates wide, the road available, the morning light doing its work on the courtyard stone, and the copper of her hair, and the straight shoulders of a man who was learning, at speed, all the things he had not known. She was tired of the cottage. She had said it as a small thing, and she had meant it as a large one. She was home. If you had believed the person you loved most had betrayed you, and then discovered, years too late, that the betrayal was a lie, could you have knocked on those gates? Could you have stood in the torchlight and asked to come in? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one. If this story reached you, hit the like button and make sure you subscribe and ring the bell. It is the surest way to never miss a story. Until next time.